Welcome everybody to the Taylor Wessing coffee break session for life science startups today. Today we have a particular focus on data protection law. So nice that you find a way to us. My name is Tim Schwartz. I'm a partner in the Munich office of Taylor Wessing, and I'm specialized obviously in data protection law with a strong focus on healthcare and life science industries. Together with my colleague Philip Heske, we will walk you through the key lines of data protection law when it comes to processing of health data for research purposes. And we will give you a broad overview of the latest developments of health data spaces in Germany. The reason why we have set up this webinar is actually because we have a lot of international clients that come to us and ask us on the conditions of use of health data for secondary purposes. And as there are some particularities in Germany, so we wanted to give you a broad overview here. So let's get started. I hope everybody of you has a warm coffee in front of you. And Philip, I hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. My name is Philip Heske, and I'm a member of the data protection team. And first of all, I want to start with a little agenda here. So we basically prepared first a little introduction to get you warm with the theme and what are the relevant topics and what is discussed with professionals. And in the next step, we're talking about the health data and data protection. In the next step, it's kind of an infrastructure topic to see how health data are shared. And in the end, we have some room for discussions and questions. Please note that the overall presentation is about to last for like 30 minutes. So we would like to answer any questions at the end.
Thank you, Philip. So let's have an introduction here. So the key assumption of our webinar is actually that we claim for better use of health data is required to unlock data treasures for improved medical research and care. I think this is more or less common sense actually by researchers, but also by patients as well as ethics committees, but also the data protection authorities in Germany that in the past have taken a quite conservative approach here, but also have recognized that the use of health data is actually quite important for further developments and improvement of the German healthcare system. And the chances are quite obviously here because of better research and development. It's necessary to have access to real world evidence data, as well as to provide for testing of healthcare treatment methods. But also for the patient care side, it's very important to have better data and access to data for diagnostic support, for instance, by healthcare professionals, but also deploying and using AI systems in medical care requires access to health data. On one side for research purposes, for training, but also when you're using it during the patient care. But in the past, actually, two major obstacles in Germany have been identified that has harmed innovation in Germany in particular. So one is the uncertainty when it comes to the interpretation of data protection laws in Germany. And the other one is actually the lack of digital infrastructure for data exchange. So the solutions here is actually to find a balanced approach between the rights to privacy of patients, but also to unlock the real world evidence data and to use enormous potential that is associated to this data. And the other solution is actually for providing a new legal framework for the sharing of health data and digitalization of healthcare, which is currently being set up in Germany. So those two topics we want to shed some light into today. Let's start with the health data and data protection side. So, Philip.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, right. So first, I want to give a little overview about the health data and associated data protection regulations on the EU and the federal level in Germany. As Tim already mentioned, healthcare companies are generally struggling with the data protection laws, not only on the EU level, but on the German level as well. And then we have some federal state laws and hospital laws that result in a more or less fragmented legal framework that is kind of unattractive for international research projects. And another thing is that the German data protection authorities, as Tim already mentioned as well, focus on a kind of, or pursue kind of a conservative approach, and the focus on the patient's interests and their right to self-determination is prevalent at all times. So this means basically that the regulations are oftentimes interpreted very narrowly and leaving little leeway for companies. And the last thing I want to mention is the topic of anonymization. And there's a kind of general uncertainty because court decisions reflect that anonymization is often insufficient, even if the personal reference can only be restored theoretically and with great effort. So in particular, clinical studies with a large number of participants are at risk here. So now I want to talk a little bit about the legal basis for processing of health data. And first of all, due to the containment of sensitive information, including information about health status, medical history, and treatments, the processing of health data is generally prohibited unless an exception applies. So besides medical treatment, the relevant exceptions are express consent or a statutory basis. On this slide, we have focused on the express consent and statutory basis and want to kind of compare these two together and try to highlight the respective defining characteristics. So first of all, express consent, especially for healthcare companies, obtaining consent not only requires a high degree of trust and shifts responsibility to the patient. But another thing is that it also creates major hurdles in terms of administrative effort, and the greatest uncertainty comes from the part that the consent is freely revocable at any time without giving reasons. That leaves companies without a legal basis for potential future processing if those express consent is revoked. So in this respect, companies should, where possible, rely on a statutory basis for processing based on the research privilege in the EU and Germany without the express consent. Although the assessment, if the requirements are met, are the responsibility of the processor, no contact with the data subject to authorize any processing is necessary, and the basis is therefore in principle permanent. So next, I want to shed some light into the R&D privileges the GDPR provides for. So since you already know about the special legal basis or the statutory basis I talked before, we have here an opening clause for the proportionate provisions respecting data provision, especially in Germany. That's section 27 BDSG. We have a look at that later, but essentially no express consent is required by the data subject if such legal basis is used. Please note that the special legal basis we referred here is just one of the many legal bases for the processing of health data the GDPR provides for, but it's irrelevant for any scientific research or R&D purposes. Next, I want to highlight in the green boxes the restrictions of the usual GDPR obligations that the processing companies are facing. First of all, the change of purpose. Here we have the privilege that the change of the purpose limitation of the GDPR is restricted, and the compatibility of processing for R&D purposes of data collected in commercial and other contexts is presumed. So we don't need another purpose if we want to process any data in an R&D environment. Further, any information obligations are insofar restricted as the provision of information involves a disproportionate effort and the data is not collected directly from the data subject, what's often the case in research scenarios. And next is the right to erasure, commonly known as the right to be forgotten, has to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis in the context of a prediction involving purpose of the processing. So that's another thing that you don't necessarily have to erase any data. And finally, the right to object is restricted if relevant data is necessary for the performance of the task in public interest. So another great privilege the GDPR provides here in this case. Now coming to the German legislation, this provision provides in Germany a highly relevant stipulation, and despite its research-friendly character, it may present itself with a certain degree of legal uncertainty. This comes was due to basically two main factors. First of all, it has to be determined if the types of R&D are generally covered by the by section 27 BDSG. So this is that can be said if the for general scientific research is to be interpreted very broadly, so that any technological development, basic research, applied research, and privately funded research is covered. This is accompanied by the core characteristics of scientific research, the transparency of research process and the results, independence and autonomy of the researchers, and the goal of gaining knowledge in the public interest. But it has to be accounted that a restriction lies in the fact that no scientific purposes has to be overridden by commercial purposes or external directives. This is especially a factor that can lead to uncertainty, because a lot of times there are at least commercial purposes connected with the whole project. And secondly, we have a balancing of interests. Based on the requirements of the GDPR, the interests of the health companies has to substantially outweigh interests of the data subject. In principle, this depends on the individual case, although it can be said that no lower or higher value is attributed to certain research areas and projects. But in the end, this can also lead to some legal uncertainty. When you have to balance the interests, there's always room for error. So in the end, legal uncertainty is to the detriment of healthcare companies, especially under consideration of the high fines if data is not processed lawfully. Next slide is about the appropriate safeguards. As already mentioned earlier, we have some privileges in the GDPR, and also the BDSG provides for some. They are accompanied with safeguards that the healthcare companies has to maintain throughout processing. And since safeguards in the digital realm are often usually subject to change and not equally significant for every company, and an appropriate implementation should factor in a variety of criteria, including risks to the rights and freedoms of data subjects. In particular, the BDSG gives some examples here, and I've shown them on the right in pink, and that are technical and organizational measures and their continuous assessment, awareness among those involved, access to personal data on a need-to-know basis, data minimization, pseudonymization, and encryption. So from our point of view, and since healthcare companies rely on the privileges shown before, the assessment and implementation of safeguards is paramount. So from a GDPR and data protection perspective, I want to share kind of a lookout here, and especially the applicable data protection laws from our point of view meant to facilitate innovation. In this regard, data protection authorities need to take a pragmatic approach in the interpretation towards existing and future data and data protection laws. And on the other hand, and that's what Tim is going to speak about in a minute, there's a considerable upside for innovative progress in medical research and healthcare when it comes to infrastructure and distribution of necessary data. So over to you, Tim.
Thank you, Philip. So to sum it up, actually, the politics are actually currently aiming for more flexible approach of interpreting data protection laws, and this is actually being shown by the new laws that are being set up for for German health data spaces that are currently being developed under German law. As I said at the beginning, a harmonized legal framework for the use and exchange of health data is required to foster innovations. So that's actually also what Germany has recognized. But first, let's have a look at EU level. So I think there are some quite good examples from other EU countries that actually already have implemented health data spaces that are functioning and that really provide flexible frameworks for data exchange and for innovation. So one of the biggest examples here is actually the Nordics, in particular Denmark and Finland, which have a quite flexible approach for sharing health data for research purposes and for secondary use. This is basically driven by a different approach of the healthcare system, which is much more based on a welfare state system, because most of the hospitals are still in public hands. And the concept is actually that they're applying that when you take the advantages of healthcare services, you also need to give something back to the society. And this is actually the argument why they allow for quite flexible approach when it comes to sharing of health data from patients for research purposes. So it's much more, lies in this social welfare state here. But also other countries such as France and also Spain have shown that they're actually quite ahead of us in providing for more flexible frameworks for data sharing. But also in Germany, in the past, we had some initiatives on organizational level. So one of the most well-known initiatives is actually the Data Integration Center. That's a health data space that's being set up by public organizations, in particular public hospitals, which allow data exchanges between public hospitals based on the broad consent concept. And also one other example is the Raccoon project that was set up during the pandemics of COVID, where X-ray images were analyzed with regard to lungs, X-ray images, and to improve healthcare treatment in connection with fighting the pandemic, COVID pandemics. But here it has been shown that actually it's quite challenging in Germany to set up such data spaces, in particular as this was set up in all 16 member states. So we had difficulties to applying a streamlined approach by the data protection authorities, which each state had to look at the data protection principle by itself. So it took almost 2 years to set this infrastructure up. So quite challenging framework here in Germany. But on the EU level, also the US recognized part of the digital infrastructure that's required, that a harmonized framework is required on the EU level. So the European health data space is still on the legislative process. It's being estimated that by the end of this year, actually the European health data space will come into law. But currently still on the legislative process, and the European health data space aims for providing a digital infrastructure for primary care and allowing for exchange of health data within all over Europe, and providing access for patients to its patient data, and also a platform for secondary use. So you have a framework for changing and using European health data to a broad extent. So, but let's have a look at the German side again. In 2023, actually, the German Health Ministry came up with a comprehensive digitalization strategy. And the main conclusion actually was made by the minister, Karl Lauterbach, where he mentions that Germany's healthcare system is decades behind in terms of digitalization. So we can no longer be responsible for this. That's why we're making a fresh start, opening up electronic patient records for everyone, in facilitating research based on health data. Modern medicine is based on digitalization and data. Using the advantage makes treatment better. So this was actually the core conclusion also by the German Ministry of Health. I mean, it's not a secret, but obviously it took quite some time to get the right initiatives going. So, and this ended up in two key cornerstones actually here of enacting two central laws. One is the Digital Act that actually provides for framework in terms of primary care, where digital healthcare services are being set up, such as telemedicine. But one of the central elements is also to providing for electronic patient file, called EPA, for everybody, which will be mandatory to use starting 2025. So every patient will receive an own electronic patient file where its patient data is being stored centrally at the German insurance funds. So that's one key cornerstone, and the other one is actually that the the Health Data Usage Act, the German Health Data Usage Act, has been enacted, which will provide a data infrastructure for the use and exchange of health data for secondary purposes. So, and let's have a closer look to the German Health Data Usage Act. As I said, the objective is to make health data available, in particular for public interest purposes, such as research and digitalization of the healthcare system, and also, for instance, for AI development. So therefore, the so-called GDNG, so it's a Gesundheitsdatennutzungsgesetz, quite a long word, German word, provides for a new harmonized framework for an infrastructure of the exchange of health data, but also allows linking of health data with central cancer registers, as well as providing a legal basis for healthcare providers to process health data that are held at the healthcare providers for quality assurance, research, and statistical purposes, and also providing a legal basis for the German health insurance funds to evaluate the data held by them for individual health risks of their insured patients. The GDNG actually anticipates and prepares for the European health data space, as I said, that will come into force by the end of this year. But obviously, we'll have some certain grace period until it will be fully applicable. So it's quite similar to the European health data space, but of course, it is limited to Germany currently, as it is local law. And once the European health data space, it will be the local implementation of the European health data space in Germany. So it allows for connectivity of the German healthcare system to the European health data space. So let's have a look at the new infrastructure for the exchange of health data that's being implemented under the GDNG. So the GDNG creates a decentralized health data infrastructure with a central data access and coordination office at the BfArM, so the German Institute for Drugs and Medical Devices. That means actually that the data is still being stored at local data spaces. But when you want to apply for access, you need to apply at the Data Access and Coordination Office, which will then decide whether you will receive access to such data. So actually the Data Access and Coordination Office acts as an intermediary between the data holders, which can be in public, but also be in private hands, and the data applicants. Another important role of the Data Access and Coordination Office is actually to maintain a public metadata catalog where it's documented which data is held and can be accessed and made available for research purposes. And one central pillar of the data exchange will be actually the research data center that's also being set up at the BfArM, which currently just holds very limited data for research purposes. But once the EPA is being active, also all the EPA primary healthcare data will automatically be transferred from the German insurance funds to the research data center and hold there for research purposes and can then be accessed. So this will open up actually lots of real-world evidence data for research purposes that can be used in the near future for primary care. Another important purpose here, or advantage is here, that the new GDNG allows for linking the research data, the data stored at the research data center to the local cancer registries, which are currently held in the federal state level, so in local hands, and so you will receive access to the various cancer registries when you pursue cancer research projects. The patients have the opportunity to opt out from the data transfer from their APA to the research data center, but so if the patient doesn't opt out actively, the data is being transferred automatically and being made available for research purposes. So it's a quite new change, great change here in Germany for using and accessing health data from primary care for research. Let's have a look at the data access side. So actually everybody located in the EU can request access to the data. Requirement is that you will use the data for permitted purposes. So if you require access, the Data Access and Coordination Office checks your request to get access and will check whether it will be used for permitted purposes. So the permitted purposes here are in particular the quality improvement and resource planning, scientific analysis, as well as research and development, as well as monitoring drug safety, and also, that's quite new and important, AI training and validation. So if you're planning to develop a new AI tool for medical purposes, you can also request access for training data and validation data through the Data Access and Coordination Office. Yeah, and as I said, another opportunity is to requesting additional access to the cancer registries. Here, it's additional required that the linking needs to be necessary for the objectives of the research project, and there it's additional wedging of interests and risk assessment that will be applied here in order to decide whether access is being granted to the cancer registries. So once the access has been authorized by the Data Access and Coordination Office, the data applicant will receive an individual data set of the data that must be pseudonymized or, wherever possible, also anonymized. So it's not necessary that the data must be anonymized, so where possible, also pseudonymized data can be provided. But at no time it's allowed to share this data with third parties not involved in the research project. So, and it's also very important to note here that actually this data infrastructure setup, it's just the infrastructure that's being governed here. So there's no legal basis associated to the data usage by the applicant. So it still needs to be ensured that when it comes to processing of personal health data, that you can rely on a legal basis for processing. And there currently have been certain discussions in Germany whether still a broad consent is required or not. This was actually mentioned by as I mentioned before, the Medicine Informatic Initiative, which are using the broad consent concept for their for their organizational setup. But as Philip mentioned, it needs to be considered whether you can here rely on a research privilege when you're using and accessing data through the GD&G setup. So and here it's a strong argument that can be used is actually that it's intention of the German politics that actually data shall be accessible and usable. So also here we claim for that a flexible framework should be applied here from a data protection perspective when it comes to the justification of using health data. As I mentioned, another secondary use option is the further processing by healthcare providers. And here, actually, the law provides an legal basis and allows healthcare providers to use the legally stored health data that they have in their databases for the permitted purposes of quality assurance, research, and statistical purposes. So here is allowed to make use of the data for these purposes that are permitted. But also here, safety measures obviously needs to be applied, such as pseudonymization or wherever possible, anonymization of the data. And when different stakeholders are being granted data access, also data access and storage concept must be implemented. Here, there's no strong prohibition to provide the data to third parties, but when you plan to do when you plan the disclosure, it's required either that the patient has consented to the disclosure, or legal justification applies, or the data upfront has been anonymized. Only under these conditions you're allowed to share this data with third parties for the purposes of quality assurance research and statistical purposes. But also here, the law as such provides a legal basis when it comes to anonymization. So because this is considered as an additional data processing operation, the law here itself has an own legal justification to do the anonymization before you provide the data to third parties. Another requirement here is the transparency requirement. So you need to inform the data subjects on the data processing by general privacy policy, but only upon individual request of a patient, you need to provide a special privacy policy informing on the individual data processing for the specific research project. Under this concept, actually, the patient has no right to object. So here again, the concept or the secondary use concept for the database evaluation of health data by German health insurance funds. So here it's also a legal basis that health insurance funds in Germany are allowed to process and evaluate the data that they hold to identify individual risks, health risks, such as detection of rare diseases or detection of cancer, as well as detection of serious health risks from drug therapies. So if the insurance fund identifies such a risk for one of its insured patients, then he's required to inform the patient of such risks. Here, the patients are given the right to object. So also the patients need to be informed that actually this evaluations will be done by the health insurance funds. In order to protect the interests of the patient and to apply a safe framework here, the GD&G provides for new confidentiality obligations and as well criminal law sanctions in particular. So it's ensured that the data is only used for permitted purposes and not passed on to third parties without authorization. And also researchers are not allowed to establish any personal reference or identify any healthcare providers. So you're not allowed to identify the patients behind the data when you're making use of the data. So when you breach this confidentiality obligations, new criminal sanctions come into play here. Also mentioned, so you have a registration requirement when you use data under the GD&G without data subject's consent. You must register for the clinical studies at the World Health Organization, and also when you have finished the research project, you're required by law to publish your results in anonymized form within 24 months in a public format. So this is actually a summary of the new health data space framework under the GD&G in Germany, and we're excited to apply these new laws in the future and see how flexible and new approaches will be applied to. So, time for questions and discussions. Philip, did we receive any question so far?
Yeah, there's one question regarding our experience with R&D companies, what they rely on and in which form they rely on the legal basis. Is it consent, or is it a statutory or the research privilege, basically, that the GDPR provides? And to answer that, we have some cases where the law requires that the companies have to obtain express consent. There obviously there's no choice for the companies, but then it mostly it's defined by the actual research purpose and what they can, the companies can define that. So basically, if you can define or outline your project, you have the ability to get consent in a specified and informed way, so that the data subject knows everything about the data processing. If that's not the case, then yeah, you basically have to rely on any statutory basis for that. For example, the research privilege. Yeah. Tim, do you have anything to add on this?
No, thank you. Okay, I think, yeah, no more questions. So we're running out of time. So we thank you for your interest and that you have taken the time to listen to us, and hope to see you soon again. Okay. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye-bye.